So tonight we're going to start with the Russian Revolution, and it gets going again in the middle of the Great War. It is almost a direct consequence of Russian military losses in the war. The Russians, they have a monarchy going into the Great War, a monarchy that has been in place for 400 years, give or take, by that point. So they are a kind of military dictatorship, like much of the rest of Europe, like the German kings and a bunch of other places. Europe is overwhelmingly run by monarchs, dictatorships, up to the end of World War I. We'll talk about the change in that in more detail, I think, next week. But the Russian people had risen up in small-scale revolutions against their monarchs before. They had done it in the 1800s a few times. They even had tried to assassinate one of the czars, the kings. I don't have that word up there yet, but the Russian word for king is czar. It's spelled T-S-A-R. It's a Russian term. So there had been assassination attempts against the czars and the czar's family. There had been small-scale rebellions that broke out in Russia. Basically, Russia is probably the most backward economy, the most ancient-style economy still amongst the major European powers by the early 1900s. They have not industrialized. They do not have many factories at all. And when you look at the map of Russia going into the early 1900s, it is a gigantic country. Land-wise, it is the biggest country in the world, and they have the largest population of Europe. Most of the land, though, is very uninhabitable. This large, gigantic, kind of desolate area called Siberia. It gets very cold there in the winter to the point where just food doesn't really grow in that area. So the major populations in Russia are along the western end of the country, kind of approaching Europe, and on the eastern end of the country, approaching the Pacific Ocean. So you have two large population centers that are really split in half by this giant chunk of land. There's something like 7 different time zones that span this thing. It is a huge territory. And you can see by this map depicting virtually all the industry that has been built up, all the factories and the factory towns are all on the European side of the country. That's where the biggest population is. You have a lot of mining in the east. You have a lot of mining also in Siberia, and mountain ranges and whatnot in those areas, going down into the kind of Himalayan, getting close to the Himalayas at least. So you have the big kind of political leadership is at a city called St. Petersburg, named after one of their first and most famous kings, Peter the Great. Moscow is a kind of further eastern city that is a secondary city. So St. Petersburg is the government capital, and you can see it's built right on the coastline, right on the edge of Europe, really right on the border with some other countries. And that was the kind of imperial capital. That was the real big city of the West. Vladivostok, I can never pronounce that word. Vladivostok is the biggest city of the East. And you can see it's very close to Japan, and again, way down in the very, very corner of the area that the Russian government dominates. And the Russians are very often looking to increase their territory, especially going down to Korea and kind of into northern China. They're always looking for opportunity to conquer new land in those areas. And that had gotten them in trouble in the early 1900s. A war broke out between Japan and Russia in 1904 and 1905. And Japan is this big and Russia is this large. So a lot of European observers thought that Japan would be crushed quickly. But Japan had industrialized and had modernized its army. So when they attacked, particularly this area down here, they hit hard and they actually won the war. So that was shocking to a lot of European observers, international policy types of experts, and that kind of announced that Japan is rising as a military power in the East. And Russia was very much humiliated, and the government was humiliated by it. Another revolution broke out against the Tsar in St. Petersburg itself in 1905. Only lasted about a month, They don't gain control of the government, and the Tsar eventually only stays in power by marching out the army and slaughtering the people who gather in the streets. So that's some basic background of what Russia looks like and some kind of history going into World War I, into the Great War. They get involved in the Great War. They launch invasions, first of East Germany, which fails miserably, then into the Balkans, which fail miserably, and by 1915 the German counterattack is now invading Russian territory and conquering Russian land. The Russian military is withdrawing. They're steadily being pushed back further and further into Russia itself, and they're losing territory. So this is a humiliating loss for the government and for the army. Makes them look inept or corrupt or stupid or something. They cannot run the government well enough to build a good fighting force. By the end of 1916, it's estimated that 2.5 million Russian soldiers have died in this catastrophe, which tends to upset the general population, right? I mean, these are people's brothers and sons and fathers and uncles and cousins and all that kind of stuff. So the general population is starting to get very, very angry. They seem to be losing massive amounts of their family members and their friends, and losing the war at the same time. So the government is very much humiliated. And the economy is basically destroyed by the war. And in St. Petersburg itself, which when the revolution hits gets renamed Petrograd, becomes the same city. At first, a strike is announced of women workers in the factories. That is announced on March 8th. The women's strike is very popular. Instead of going to work, they take to the streets and they march around. They picket. A general strike in the whole city is called for 2 days later. And the general strike is hugely powerful. It completely takes down the Russian economy. The Russian economy grinds down to a standstill. And these are pictures from literally the strikers going through the streets, and obviously watched by the authorities. The Tsar has a big problem on his hand at this point. He has to somehow convince them to go back to work, to continue making the things in the factories that are needed to fight the war and generally keep the economy functioning. In his desperate move, he orders the army into the street to force the protesters, the strikers, to disperse and either go back home or go back to work. And that's always a dangerous thing, because sometimes the army, especially when the king gives the order that if the people don't disperse, if they stay in the streets, to just shoot them, that is often a turning point in revolutions. Because the army goes into the street and they see sometimes their family members and their friends on the other side that they're ordered to kill. And in this instance, as in many other revolutions, the troops and some of the commanders refuse to follow orders. Not only do they refuse to shoot at the public gathered in the streets, many of these military guys take their guns and they go join the protest. So you have a huge kind of disunion within the army itself. A lot of them are leaving the army and joining the movement. So the king has now lost virtually all military power. His orders are not being followed. The Russian Duma, which is basically their semi-elected parliament, attempts to criticize the king for doing this, and his response is to dissolve the Duma, the parliament. Tells the elected leaders of Russia to go home, that he is going to rule the country personally as king, as the Tsar. The Duma didn't like that very much, and they refused to disperse. They refused to go home. In fact, they start passing kind of consensus documents, declarations, that the king has lost so much power and he is taking so many authoritarian moves that he is not going to be allowed to run the government anymore. So they pass declarations where they announce that they will run the government and that the king is basically going to be knocked out of power.
That's the king?
That's the king. So that's the Russian word for king down here, Tsar. And oftentimes in textbooks you'll see it kind of bastardized into English. It gets written C-Z-A-R, but that's bad translation basically. It's a kind of English way of pronouncing this Russian word. So all this is happening very quickly, just in a matter of days. And on the 15th of March, just 1 week after the original strike of the women, on March 8th, just 1 week later, he abdicates, which means he formally gives up his throne. He signs a document saying that he is not the king any longer. And the monarchy is removed completely. His son is not going to rise to be the next king. They just get rid of the idea of kingship completely. And the parliament, the Duma, will run the government from here on out. So this happens very, very quickly, as revolutions often do, especially in the 1800s. Revolutions take down governments in the span of just a few days. This is unthinkable stuff just 2 weeks before. The king was all-powerful, and under this guy's reign, literally anyone who complained could be kidnapped and executed by the government. He was a pretty heavy-handed type of guy in criticism against the monarchy. So just by the people uniting and coming together and getting the support of the army, they take down their ruler within a matter of days, and a fairly bloodless revolution. So Nicholas II is out. So questions about any of this so far? Yeah. Say again?
Will they put on trial at all? The king?
No, they're going to be imprisoned, basically. The provisional government that rises in Parliament, they're going to elect a prime minister and all these other kinds of representative type things. They're going to decide to allow him to stay in one of his countryside palaces, and they'll give him and his family food and some guards and stuff like that to protect them. But basically, get him out of town, put him someplace remote, and hope he doesn't come back.
And who's put in charge?
The group that really takes control, it calls itself the Provisional Government, but is basically run by a kind of socialist democrat type of political party. And that is the group that will basically have the majority in the parliament, in the Duma, and they will start passing new laws to basically rebuild the Russian government. The first number one thing they want to do is write a constitution. Russia did not have a constitution at that point. Like a lot of monarchies, and some today, they don't have constitutions. They are run more by tradition and common law and those types of things. So the Russians do a very kind of Enlightenment type of gesture when they take down their monarchy. Like a lot of other countries, they start talking about writing a constitution to have a written document that outlines the different powers that different branches of government will have and all that. Like a constitutional convention for Russia. So they immediately start passing laws that say, we're going to write a constitution, but they don't even trust themselves to write it because, they're politicians. They've been elected before the revolution hit. So they say they're going to have a new vote in a few months. This is all happening in March of 1917. They're going to have a new vote over the summer where any adult person can go vote for representatives from their community. Whoever gets the most votes will go to the capital city, and a meeting is set for January 1918, January of the new year, where those elected people, often not even professional politicians, these are people from communities. They could be doctors or lawyers, or usually get some kind of fairly educated person, right? You don't want to get a kind of bumpkin going off and writing the Constitution. So they're going to have these elections, and these representatives are set to meet in January 1918 to start writing a Russian constitution. So that's the number one thing that is pretty universally accepted amongst the Russian people. They need a constitution. And they don't trust the sitting politicians to write it. And this group that often you get this term constituent assembly. You get in the French Revolution, a whole bunch of others. That will be the group that is elected to formally start writing the Constitution in January. So they are building up democracy. Democracy from the bottom, which is what democracy is supposed to be. They start passing a lot of laws that guarantee civil rights. They start guaranteeing a kind of liberal democracy as we think of it, or at least as they thought of it back then. Representative politics, every person gets a vote, on and on and on, all that kind of stuff. Majorities in the parliament will make the laws and whatnot. They create a parliamentary system, which means parliament will choose a prime minister who will basically take over the executive powers, the old powers that the king used to have, basically. Will run the army and direct foreign policy and enforce the laws and all that kind of stuff. Run the treasury and taxation and all that. So that's what we call the parliamentary system. Parliamentarism, interchangeable terms that you often get in textbooks. And they pass an 8-hour workday, which is a very progressive thing that even the United States largely hadn't done yet in their own progressive movement.
So they started voting for women before we did?
Yes. Yep. The United States is and has historically been pretty far behind the kind of liberal progressive curve compared to Europe. Now, Europeans, Britain outlawed slavery in their empire in like 1832. Took the United States another 33 years to do it. Britain gives women their vote in the late 1800s. The United States takes another 40 years. I mean, the United States is eventually becomes a very conservative country that doesn't bring large social changes forward very quickly. And you can see that, today. Things like gay marriage or gay rights. I mean, all that stuff is just considered common in Europe, and in the United States it's like this big controversy. And Europeans are just completely confused about why that is. It doesn't make any sense to them. But that's a big controversial thing here. Okay. Where is it? Oh, it's not even right. Constitutional Democratic Party. They're basically a kind of democracy-based movement that wants to use socialism in a lot of ways. Government running of the army and railroads and stuff like that. So the party's power mostly comes from the middle classes who see themselves as empowered by this push toward democracy, this revolution. And a lot of wealthy people who didn't like the king in the first place, because the king often took land from them, took tax privileges from them. A lot of wealthy people in Russia were very much against the monarchy because it was so heavy-handed and just hadn't brought a lot of industrialization to Russia. So even the aristocrats, the wealthy landowners, and the educated elite were very often against the monarchy. So you have one of these very rare moments where you have the rich and the working class are actually together on something, which historically doesn't usually happen all that often. One of the major problems that this political party will incur as they are pushing this revolution forward and trying to get the Constitution written is a group called the Soviets. The Soviets are a rising kind of political party that declare themselves to be the direct representatives of working communities. So if you're working in a factory with 300 other people, oftentimes those factory workers get together and elect a Soviet from their group, 1 or 2 or 5 people that will go forward and say they represent your factory workers. That is what the term Soviet means. And you get this in farming communities, different working class communities, also among some soldier communities. So they declare themselves to be the closest link to the people, politically. And the Soviets eventually themselves split into 2 different factions. First are called the Mensheviks, who want to write a constitution and slowly move the Russian economy towards socialism, which means the government will tax its citizens, will use that tax revenue to do some basic things like run the railroads, run electricity lines, run the army, some very basic government spending. That is mostly described as socialism throughout the world. So they start arguing that they want to be more like Britain or France or Germany in some instances. They want government to run very large systems that they don't really trust private companies to run, like health insurance. What do you know? Well, they don't have health insurance in Russia yet, but a lot of West European countries, including Germany, even under the German monarchy, the Kaisers, they had near universal health insurance. So that's another way that the United States has sadly lagged very far behind. But eventually their kind of eventual goal is to create a socialist type of government that is ruled by democracy, voting rights, and a constitution. Outside of the Mensheviks, you have a much more extreme faction that become known as the Bolsheviks. And they want a quick movement, a revolutionary movement that will destroy the rich and create the Karl Marx vision of a proletariat state, the state of the workers, the classless society, where there are no rich and are no poor, that virtually no matter what job you have in society, everyone gets paid about the same amount. That will have full civil rights for all people, full voting rights. So the difference between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks is that the Mensheviks want to do this somewhat slowly, maybe over a couple decades or so, and eventually get to the end point. The Bolsheviks are right now types of people. And they talk about a new revolution to completely destroy capitalism and all of its inequalities and all of its misery and suffering for the mass workers of society. You see the difference between those two? So questions about these?
So the Bolsheviks is kind of consisting of like the working class and the poor?
Well, you have working class and poor people in both of these groups. It's just their major difference isn't where they come from, it's what they want the government to eventually look like. And the Mensheviks are willing to allow some amount of differences in income as long as a socialist state actually supports the poor and helps them survive. The Bolsheviks do not want capitalism. They do not want inequality. At least that's what they say. That'll change later. So the Bolsheviks are much more extreme and much more militant. Other questions? Nope. Okay. The major Bolshevik leader is a guy named Vladimir Lenin. He was a lifetime revolutionary, basically. He had been talking about revolution in Russia since the 1800s, since the late 1800s. And in fact, his older brother had participated in one of the assassination attempts against one of the former czars. So his older brother had been executed in public, and that's something that Vladimir did not forget. So he hated the monarchy deeply. And he was such a revolutionary person that he was jailed in Russia in the early 1900s and was exiled to Germany. He went to Germany and lived there. So when the war broke out, the Germans get a hold of him. And they figure the best way to knock, or one of the best ways or possible ways to knock the Russians out of the war, is get a hold of this guy and send him back to Russia. Maybe he can start a revolution. And that's exactly what they do. They put him on a train with a bunch of his family and supporters and stuff, and they just send a train with all these people right back into the heart of Russia. They basically take a dart and throw it at the board. Hope it works. Have fun with that. So on his way back from Germany going into Russia, he writes a statement that he calls the April Theses, the April Ideas. So this is after the initial revolution has displaced the Tsar, has kicked them out, and now the provisional government is running things, and Vladimir Lenin doesn't think it's enough. These are basically his three demands. He says this is what the Bolsheviks should do if they get to power. This is their kind of policy program. This is their system. These are their goals. Number one is get out of the war. Peace. Immediately declare a peace with Germany. End the war. Number two is go to the wealthy people who have huge tracts of land, take that land from them, break it up into small little pieces, and give it out to peasant farmers. the major redistribution of land, which is very popular with the working classes. And he often talks about doing the same thing with large factories that are owned by very rich people. And these rich people, they sit in their houses and drink wine. They don't really do any work themselves. In fact, they usually never even set foot in the factory, so they wouldn't know how to run the thing even if they were allowed to. So he says we're going to do the same thing with a lot of really big factories. The government should take control and allow the factory workers to run it themselves because they're the experts. They know how much that factory can produce in a day or a year, and they know how to run it most efficiently. So he says he wants to take the land and take the factories and basically give them back to the people. And that's basic kind of Marxist theology, Marxist ideology, or Bolshevik ideology. Go after the rich, destroy their privileges, take all the extra revenue and all that stuff they have because they've only earned it by being greedy and hurting people, exploiting workers, and take all that extra stuff that they don't need to survive, maybe let them keep a house or something, keep some land so they can be a farmer too, and then turn over all that excess wealth to the people. So he has a pretty popular set of ideas, especially with the working class. Yeah?
You mentioned before that France was already socialist, and so was Germany.
To a certain extent, not absolutely completely, but yeah.
So was Vladimir Lenin, did he get these ideas straight from Karl Marx? Or
Yes, he read Marx. He read Marx's works and was very much inspired by them. And that this kind of Marxist economic vision that he read about and really loved and thought it would be the most source of freedom for all of humanity, that really combined with this hatred of the Russian government as it existed. So he's not just against the monarchy without a vision. He has a kind of idea where he wants to push Russian society and the Russian economy toward. So, yeah. He is a committed communist, as Marx described himself, a communist. And this often gets into the problem of what's the difference between socialism and communism, right? Communism wants the government to run everything. Every factory, every business, that should be owned and operated by government, right? That's Marxist-style communism. That's what he talked about. Socialism says, usually, government should run the most important fundamental things that people use on a daily basis: schools, electricity systems, roads, transportation, railroads, stuff like that. Big systems that we don't really want to trust just one company to run. And allow private businesses to still operate as long as they aren't allowed to harm the public. That is, in general, the difference between communism and socialism. Other questions? No? Alrighty. The problem for Lenin is that he's not in power. He is traveling on a train heading back toward Russia. The major kind of Democratic Constitutional Party is in power. Its prime minister is a guy named Kerensky. And this group wants to continue fighting the war. They view themselves as inheriting the government policy from the monarchy. And they thought it would be too humiliating of the Russian nation to immediately withdraw from the war. So they want to fight the war and possibly even gain back some land that the Russians had lost to especially Germany, to the German invasions. But they want to fight it more democratically, which, how do you fight a democratic war? It often doesn't work out very well. But they tried to reform the military, especially the Russian military, to make it more democratic, more kind of revolutionary, to give the soldiers more of a voice in policy. And the number one kind of biggest and most symbolic policy that they passed is called Army Order Number 1, which allows the Russian soldiers to elect their officers. So the leaders of the army will be directly elected by the fighting men on the front lines. And guess which guys they started electing to be their officers? Who? Well, not just Bolsheviks, but in general, what do soldiers not want to do? Especially in this war. They don't want to fight. So they elect other soldiers who say, if you make me a general, I'm going to withdraw. We're going to retreat so we don't have to fight this stupid war anymore. So a lot of the new officers going into the Russian army are the ones who don't want to fight, even though their government's telling them to fight. So you have a conflict just as a result of democracy. This leads to a large amount of what historians have called chaos in the military. Certain pieces of the army refuse to fight, even when the Germans continue to invade. In general, the Russian army takes a basic stance. They will not attack the Germans anymore. They will not try to invade and take new land, but they will defend against German attacks. So they say, we will defend the Russian nation and Russian territory, but we're not going to attack offensively anymore. That's their compromise. And it's a very kind of interesting period of military history. One general in particular was very unhappy with all this military chaos. He wanted to keep fighting. So he takes his army and doesn't attack the Germans. He starts marching toward the capital city to knock Kerensky and this party out of office. And who knows what that general would do after that. So the party and Kerensky now have to go to the masses of the city, the millions of people living in the city, and say, we have to fight against our own army to keep the revolution in place, because if this general conquers the city, he might bring back the monarch, he might bring back the czar. I mean, who knows what this guy's going to do? Might proclaim himself to be the new king. That's a big problem. So at this point, you have the people of the city rising up and oftentimes being armed by their government to fight against their own army. Eventually, this general does not make it to the city. He kind of loses and his movement kind of peters out. But this shows how weak and desperate Kerensky and these democratically elected parliamentary leaders actually are. And that creates a big problem for them, because Lenin is watching closely, and Lenin is a no-holds-barred type of politician. Lenin starts giving speeches through the summer of 1917. And he and his friend Trotsky, which is another kind of theoretical communist leader, start making speeches. They start gathering together the Bolshevik forces within the capital city, and they start planning. The basic statement is, the provisional government is not working, it is weak, it is not doing its job, and we have to do something about it. And they do. They lead a smaller revolution, basically a coup. The Bolsheviks get a bunch of guns and they invade the government buildings on the night of November 8th of 17. They literally arrest the Kerensky and the other leaders, throw them in jail, and put Lenin in charge of the government. And that creates the next systematic problem, the next series of problems. So Lenin is now in control. Here's an image of the Bolshevik soldiers literally on patrol outside the building, protecting their new government, the Bolshevik dictatorship, basically. This is not an elected move. This is a quick coup. So Lenin is the head of the new government, the second revolution. He calls it the Council of the People's Commissars, which sounds kind of democracy-ish, the government of the people. His first major problem is he is now in office in November of 17, and that damn Constituent Assembly is going to start to meet in January of 18, in just 2 months, to start writing a Russian constitution. And his problem is that there aren't many Bolsheviks in that assembly. The Bolsheviks lost the summer elections. They were a minority party. So Lenin has a choice to make. Does he allow them to meet and write a constitution which could literally write him out of power? And since the Bolsheviks don't have much say in what's written, they don't have much of a vote, they're probably going to get outvoted when the constitution goes forth. So Lenin makes a decision. He goes to their first meeting in January of 18 and delivers a speech. And the speech basically says, this meeting cannot happen. Why? Because the bourgeoisie, the rich, have wormed their way into winning these elections. He says there are capitalist spies in this group that are set to write the Constitution. So as a defender of the working class people, the leader of this government, I will not allow this group to meet and actually write the Constitution. We are going to do something else. And his direct quote, he calls them the malignant bourgeoisie, basically the cancer of society. The rich have gotten in, and if you allow them to write the Constitution, they will write it to favor the rich. So he says, not going to happen on my watch. Does all that make sense? So this is really the point where Lenin and his government have completely rejected democracy in the few and small forms that it has existed. It has arrested the provisional government, thrown them in jail. It's not allowing the elected representatives of the people to now meet and write a constitution. So democracy is in the trash can, for all intents and purposes, in what Lenin starts renaming the Communist Party. This is where democracy and representation go out the window in Russia. The Bolshevik Party changes its name to the Communist Party and makes all other political parties illegal in Russia. Starts calling this new government the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So it's not just going to be Russia. They're going to go out and conquer other countries and bring them into this growing USSR. And that's their official flag, which is, the two major working tools of the masses. You have the hammer, which is a factory tool, and a sickle, which was a farming tool. It's used to get down low and you cut crops, usually wheat. So it's like a kind of rounded knife. And it becomes a symbol of the Communist Party and of the Soviet government going into the future. The Soviet government proclaims the right to arrest anybody who complains about what's going on, because the only people in Lenin's mind who would complain are the capitalists. The people who don't like communism will fight to resist it in any way, shape, or form. So Lenin says, I am doing everything that the working masses should support, so the only people who complain are those who want to bring back the monarchy or bring back capitalism and all its inequalities and misery for the working masses. So the government officially says that they can suspend civil rights for virtually anyone in Russia, and eventually the other kind of areas that fall into the USSR, because they are a threat to the people. They are a threat to the revolution. And he will always find more capitalist spies out there to constantly stoke the fears of the Russian people that the capitalists are trying to come back, that they're forming plots and counter revolutions to take Lenin and his people out, maybe bring back the monarchy or something. And this is all happening very quickly in early 1918. And this is stuff that's happening just in a few weeks. So these are all very important and fast-moving steps. All right. The communists, when Lenin really solidifies his control of the government in January and February of 1918, he follows his number one demands for international policy: get out of the war. So he immediately opens negotiations with Germany to sign a treaty to end the Russian war. And that happens in March 1918. The Russians lose a lot of territory, especially in Eastern Europe. These areas that are known even today as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, down into what is today thought of as Belarus and Ukraine. This was all part of Russia going into the war. These are all areas that the Germans had invaded and conquered. So they get detached from Russia, from the USSR, by this treaty, and Lenin accepts it. Does anyone want to take a guess at why Lenin, officially, why does he say that this is acceptable to the Russian people, to lose this territory?
You think you're just going to go back and conquer it later?
Not just conquer it, but his argument is, the Soviet Union is only the first step in the worldwide communist revolution to eliminate capitalists. He says that all these areas are eventually going to turn to communism also. So what's the point in fighting for them if they're going to be our friends very quickly? They're going to overthrow their capitalists and their governments. And they will join us. So what's the point in, haggling over a border if eventually the peoples on our border are going to be ruled by friendly governments? It doesn't work out that way, but that's his belief. And that was also Marx's belief, right? That it's going to start in one place and it's going to spread all over the world very fast. And if it doesn't spread everywhere across the world, it'll probably fail. Because the communists will, or the capitalists will all get together and try to kill off the first communist country, or communist economy. Okay, Lenin's next major problem is there are a whole lot of people out there now who don't like the Bolsheviks or the Communist Party or Lenin personally. So the communists only actually have control over the capital city in Moscow and some of the kind of interior areas of the western part of the country. They do not have control over virtually the rest of Russia. And they are attacked on all sides. There are pro-monarchy Russians who raise an army to fight against Lenin's government. There are anti-monarchy but pro-provisional government people who are upset that Lenin, cooed Kerensky and all those out. There are a few who still want to fight the war, so they're pissed off at Lenin for that. There is the looming possibility that the Germans will keep attacking for some reason to gain more land. And for good measure, the United States, Britain, and France all launch invasions in the north and in the south to try to destroy Lenin's government. For two major reasons. Number one, they hate the fact that he had declared peace. They wanted Russia to continue fighting Germany to distract Germany from the Western Front because the war is ongoing. Number two, Lenin has created a communist economy. France, Britain, the United States are capitalist economies. And capitalists hate communism. They are diametrically opposed. They are enemies forever. Because they view each other as the source of evil in the world. The capitalists hate communism because they think that it will destroy the economy if you try to make everybody equal. You will make uneducated and weak people the kind of equivalent of the strong leaders of society. And obviously the communists hate capitalism and hate capitalists because they say they're too greedy. They're so greedy that they're willing to kill each other in pursuit of profit. So the capitalist economies, led by the United States, Britain, and France, also invade to fight against Lenin. So Lenin's government is fighting like 6 different enemies all at the same time. And it's very chaotic and very, very bloody. This civil war goes on for years. And to make a very long story very short, the communists will win. One thing that the communists made sure to do was to destroy the monarchy's position, the royalist position. They do that by executing the royal family, every single one of them. Not just the former king, but all of his inheritors, all of his daughters, all of his kids. Kill them all. Because if you leave one of them alive, that can give a kind of glimmer of hope to people who want to bring back the monarchy eventually. So in July 1918, they are taken into the basement of the palace they are staying, and they are all executed one morning under Lenin's order. So the monarchist position is wiped out. But that often only angers the royalists more, the people who wanted the monarchy back, because now they're all dead, and so a lot of the royalists will now fight to the bitter end. They are not willing to compromise, and they will fight to the death very consistently. Okay, going forward, I don't want to get into the details of battle by battle or anything like that. But the communists, the Lenin party, the Lenin government, eventually wins the civil war just by being more brutal than its enemies for the most part. The anti-communist forces, the Americans, the French, the British, the Germans, the royalists, the kind of Kerensky followers, the militarists, and capitalists in general, they do not agree on how to attack Lenin's government. They don't come up with any kind of consistent military policy or plan. They just kind of attack patchwork haphazardly. and that doesn't work over time. And in fact, it appears that most of the anti-communists they don't even like each other very much. That's always a problem in fighting forces. They can't even agree on what their eventual goal is. The only thing that they agree on is that they don't like Lenin. So that's a major problem just for their own coordination. And they don't plan their attacks to be most effective. They attack one at a time, and eventually the communists are able to fight back and win a very long and very bloody civil war. Another reason the communists won is that they were just most brutal against their own population. Any soldier in the communist army, and these armies are drafted, they're not usually volunteer armies, any soldier who disobeys an order is executed on the spot. So they are threatened by their own leaders. You either fight, you follow orders, or you die. And that's something that the Soviet Union will use again and again and again in many different wars it fights. And anyone in general society who complains about what the communists are doing are labeled enemies of the people and are therefore attacked also. Jailed, exiled, often just disappeared, executed without any trial. So this becomes known as the Red Terror, the Communist Terror. The government centralizes power by basically claiming to have the right to take any property, any personal property from anybody that the government thought would be useful for fighting the war. So if you have a shovel in your backyard or a shotgun in your house, the government may come banging on your door and taking it and saying they have the right to do this in order to win the Civil War, and therefore ensure that the government of the working class, supposedly, will survive against these kind of lineup of different enemies. They call that war communism. And anyone who accuses the government of being corrupt, they're only taking my property, not because it's useful for winning the war, but just because they want some money. They want to take valuable things from my family. You can also be executed on the spot. So this is a government by terror, basically. This is becoming a totalitarian government that obviously is not, in many instances, acting in the interest of its own people, because the people start complaining until the lesson goes forward that if you complain, you get killed. So this Russian Civil War is hugely bloody, and not just because of attacks from outside, but because of what the government's doing to its own people. It becomes a very rigid and harsh dictatorship. They establish spy networks to make sure that people meeting in bars and coffee houses aren't even talking about how bad the Lenin government is, or how bad communism in general is working. It is a very horrible time to live in that country. And fifth, the Lenin government says that they're being attacked by foreigners, so they appeal to Russian nationalism. We are going to defend Mother Russia, we're going to defend our ancestral homeland and all that kind of stuff against foreign domination, which is something that often works propaganda-wise against populations. So that's the kind of lineup of ideas and reasons that the communists eventually win against what looked like overwhelming odds at first. So questions about any of those? And these are the kinds of things that you often see dictatorships doing, even today, right? And if you watch the news from Syria on a daily basis, it's pretty horrible on both sides. But this is what governments and leaders often do in their desperation to survive. And there's no question that if Lenin's government fell and he was caught, he'd probably be executed very quickly. So a lot of these guys know that they're fighting for their lives, especially the leadership. Okay, so Lenin's government survives the Civil War and going into about 1922, 1923, when the war is basically ended. And Lenin personally did believe, and it's very apparent when you read his writings, that the communist revolution is not just going to hit in Russia, it's going to spread very quickly across the globe. People that are marginalized and angry and victimized and hungry and poor across the world will rise up against their capitalist leaders And either in revolution that topples governments or through some kind of strike that destroys the economy, some way or another, the communist revolution will spread outside of Russia and go to all the other important places, industrialized places of the world. And he thought that this was inevitable, as Karl Marx frequently stated. And we've gone over the details of that. And the idea of economics as a science that proves that this is historically inevitable. And his foreign policy is literally to support communist uprisings in other places. That's what he wants to do. He says that communism is the system of equality that will bring the future of human freedom to the world. He saw the world as enslaved under the wage slave system that Marx described. And most of the people over the globe as victimized by the few rich elite. And of course, his public statements about the worldwide communist revolution very much worried other government leaders. Because a lot of countries, in particular Germany, Austria, Hungary, even eventually when you get Turkey, the United States, Britain, France, they all have large communist followings at this point. There are communist political parties in all of those countries. So especially the United States, because U.S. history class, this very much worries Germans who try to take control of the German government at the end of World War I. The Hungarian government is toppled for a little while by communist uprisings. And there is a major political scare in the United States. A president at the time, Wilson, declares that communism is an enemy of the United States, basically. And he instructs the U.S. federal government to go after the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, and their leaders. Often restrict their ability to get their parties on ballots during elections. Often jails their leaderships. And the guy who had run as the socialist presidential candidate, Eugene Debs, eventually is arrested and exiled. His citizenship is revoked and he's forced into exile from the United States just for his political beliefs, for speeches he'd given. I mean, he never rose up, he never took a gun to the White House or tried to overthrow the government or anything, but just because of his ideology. So his constitutional rights went out the window because the government felt that a possible communist uprising is imminent. That it's a major problem. And in this instance, hardcore kind of authoritarianism from the top down. Government power to destroy those movements is the solution, in Wilson's view, and the view of a lot of Americans. And again, they ramp up the propaganda machine to get people to accept this stuff. So you have even a few assassinations of socialist and even union leaders, especially around Chicago. The FBI is created literally as an anti-communist internal police force. And some communist groups had tried to bomb certain politicians or judges or stuff like that. That had happened. So that literally gave the U.S. government an excuse, a reason to build up things like the FBI to be a pretty repressive political police. A lot of especially socialists and communists in the United States are also union organizers who go into working factories or go to farms and they talk about uniting the workers to get collective bargaining or get some kind of rights or something. So in the United States, a lot of socialism and communist leaders are also identified with labor unionization. So you often, whoops, don't have it there? No, that's strange. I had some political cartoons that showed like a miniature Karl Marx climbing up the American flagpole with like a torch to burn the whole American flag, and his T-shirt says Union. So there's a lot of very close kind of propaganda connections between the Union movement and what Wilson defines as an anti-government movement, which is strange because a lot of unions want government support in collective bargaining, so it's a sometimes difficult connection to make. But he tried. Let's see. I have a video to show you to outline what was happening, especially at the end of the war, 1919, with these communist uprisings, and how it's connected to Lenin's view of communism in general. So the interesting thing about the United States in relation to Lenin's government is that the United States is claiming to, fight for democracy and whatnot, fight for capitalism, but they take on a whole lot of the very similar steps that Lenin took. Eliminate the opposition through violent, sometimes repression. So you get American leaders and Lenin's communist leaders saying, we're both fighting for the masses, we're fighting to defend the people against a kind of insidious enemy from within. And they use very repressive tactics to accomplish those goals. Another major problem after the communists win the Civil War by about 1921-22 is that the Russian economy is absolutely destroyed. Not just from its experience in the Great War, but the Civil War also. So they control the government, they control all of Russia, what they call the Soviet Union by now. But the economy is functioning at only about 20% of the size as it was in 1914 when the war started. So even though Russia was economically backward, unindustrialized in 1914, in 1921 they're only a shell of what it had been. So Lenin's next big goal is to rebuild the economy as fast as possible. He creates a series of plans that become known in general as the New Economic Policy. And that again is the Soviet government will run the economy pretty closely, and they'll create plans for factories to produce so much this year and next year, and production is supposed to increase efficiency is supposed to increase. So this new economic plan is, again, communism writ large, and it can be very repressive against anyone who argues against it. His hope was to industrialize Russia as fast as possible. So they are moving ahead very quickly in the 1920s and building factories and building up their efficiency. But they will be far behind Western Europe still by the time the 1930s get started, especially by 1929, when the Wall Street crash hits and the Great Depression starts to rise. Lenin started in 1922, had a stroke, and then had a series of other strokes. So after about 1922, he is pretty much hospitalized. He's incapacitated. So he is not going to be, after he comes up with these economic ideas, he's not going to be the major political leader in the Soviet Union anymore. So the next debate is who will take up that leadership. The struggle in Lenin's wake really boils down to two different communist leaders. One is Trotsky, who had been Lenin's kind of right-hand guy, his second in command, through the Civil Wars, going all the way back to the Revolution. So Trotsky is well known to communist supporters and well known to Russian society. Stalin is less known. Joseph Stalin is more of a career bureaucrat. He's a believer in communism, and he is basically a member of the Communist Party that is rising through the ranks. He continually gets promoted within the party in the 1920s. To the point by about 1927 or so, he is the secretary of the party, which means he gets to appoint his friends throughout the party. So he really owns the party. He puts people into power and they owe him favors. And the major argument by about 1927 is Trotsky wants to launch into full industrialization as fast as possible to help the Soviet Union catch up to the West with industrialization, make the Soviet Union into an industrial powerhouse, just like Germany or Britain or the United States, and to continue supporting the revolution throughout the world. internationally. Stalin is much more quiet on what he really wants because he is a politician. He's not so much a grand theorist. And Stalin understands that if you take a hard stance on something, that is going to anger some people, like a lot of politicians today. That's why they avoid saying anything of substance as much as possible. You know, get a politician in front of a microphone and they'll talk for hours, but they won't really say anything because they want to avoid upsetting people. And Stalin's one of those kinds. He vaguely talks about socialism in one country, which basically means we want to build up the communist power in the Soviet Union first, then maybe in a few decades try to export and spread the revolution elsewhere. Stalin eventually wins this argument through brute force. Through his friends in the party, he gets Trotsky expelled from the Communist Party and then exiled from the country in general. So Stalin takes control by about 1927, going into 28. And because he is leader of the party, he is the one that appoints members of the party, he controls the political scene and will for the rest of his life. So he's going to be in control going into the 1950s. Trotsky goes to Mexico and lives there until he is assassinated in 1940. So what does Stalin want for all this? Number one, he takes on Trotsky's plan for crash industrialization as fast as possible. So he has eliminated his enemy and then starts using his enemy's ideas for the far future. He comes up with 5-year plans, saying that in 5 years we want to have this many factories with this much efficiency. And 5 years later he'll come up with a new 5-year plan to try to push it further and further and further. Stalin's plan, much like Lenin and Trotsky, is to industrialize as fast as possible. Because he says that wars against capitalist countries are inevitable. They will happen. So wars against Germany and France and Britain and the United States will happen at some point. They have factories to mass produce guns and tanks and bombs and all the stuff they need to fight with. So if we don't have factories in our country, we're going to get slaughtered. So he says it's a national defense priority to build up factories. And he becomes overwhelmingly obsessed with military hardware. So Stalin wants to accomplish, probably within about 5 or 10 years, what the Europeans took the whole 1800s to do in industrializing their countries. So he's trying to do it fast. And he doesn't care about stepping on some toes. He realizes that he is going to need some money to build these factories. You have to get a hold of the supplies somehow. And often you're going to have to buy them from other countries. So his plan for raising money is to take all the private farms in the Soviet Union and collectivize them, which means nationalize, which means the government takes control of private farms. And the government will decide where it needs farmers. If there's one area of the country that is, can grow food well, but there's not enough farmers living there, he will pick some people up out of the Soviet Union from one area and force them to go live somewhere else and work for the government. Some people don't like being forced around by the government, being told where to live. And there's restrictions on travel, there's restrictions on who you can write letters to. It's a very repressive government. And a lot of people don't like being moved around like that, especially people living in the Ukraine. And to teach them a lesson and force their adherence to his plan, he starves them. He refuses to allow food to be moved into those areas. And it's reported by about the mid-30s, about 10 million people die from his starvation policy in the Ukraine. So this is mass murder. And he becomes probably the worst example of dictatorship in human history. And that's even before World War II starts, and it gets worse at that point. Anyone who complains about what he's doing, especially in the 30s when he starts eliminating all possible rivals within the party and throughout society, will be purged. They will be arrested, charged with treason or some other trumped up charge, sent into a court that Stalin largely controlled, because if the judge votes them guilty, the judge is going to be attacked next. So these become like kangaroo courts, where you get like 1 day to present your legal defense, and then you're found guilty and sent to a prison camp called a gulag, a work camp, somewhere in Siberia or something. where they wanted to build a factory or a dam or a waterway or a canal or some crazy scheme. Not really crazy, but they're using slave labor to build it, prison labor. Or you are executed, or you're kicked out of the country. A lot of people don't even make it to trial. A lot of people who complain about Stalin just disappear one night. And you literally get a secret police force in the Soviet Union that exists at night, and it goes into people's houses, and people are never heard from again. And this becomes known as the Stalinist system. Anyone who complains, anyone who's related to someone who complains is attacked mercilessly. And that's the system that he will use to keep control over the country. Today we call it totalitarian systems. He had spy networks everywhere. They read people's mail. They listened on phone calls. They had spies that infiltrated families. So if you have a cousin show up on your door one day and say, "Hey, I haven't seen you for a few years. Can I stay at your place for a while?" That could be a government spy. This becomes very scary stuff. So this becomes what we call police state. The police, the internal police, the repressive forces are everywhere, and they're greatly feared. And that's how Stalin keeps control, and will till the day he dies. So questions about anything that Stalin's doing and what he's about? Yeah.
He killed more people than Hitler, right?
Without doubt. Yeah. Stalin is, a dictator on the level of Hitler, but Stalin has a bigger country and a bigger population to play with, and is around for 25 years.
So most of the people he killed are like in these small pockets of people talking about or
Yeah. And not just in little towns or something. This in the capital city. So if you're sitting at a Starbucks, down on the corner, you don't want to talk too loudly, because another person sitting there with a notepad may be writing down what you say and trying to find out your name and where you live, and they turn it over to the police force, and then you may be visited one night. That's the level of this stuff. You don't listen to certain music too loud. If you're driving in your car, listening to a song that's talking about freedom, you could be visited. It is that harsh. The state controls everything. And because Stalin and Lenin, Stalin becomes he presents himself, he often wears a military-style uniform, even though he wasn't ever really in the army. He presents himself more as a bureaucrat, like the head guy that's making the lists and running the economic policy. So you often see these images of him standing around with papers or like a clipboard or something like that. That's his kind of popular image. But because Lenin and Stalin become the leaders and the guys who control the first major communist economy, they're often compared to Karl Marx, and a lot of people today say, well, communism in the Soviet Union failed, therefore Karl Marx's ideas are an absolute failure. It's important, though, to understand that these two guys in the Soviet Union do very different things from anything that Karl Marx is likely to have ever accepted. And it's very clear if you read Marx's work and compare him to their policies. So number one, Marx said that the revolution is inevitable and historically proven, scientifically proven by economics. And it will spread throughout the world. If it is inevitable, then why do you have people like Lenin and Stalin, who are professional revolutionaries, that are looking to push it forward further and further and further, as hard and as fast as possible? If it's inevitable, why not just let it happen, right? Theoretically. So they go against Marx just in their kind of pursuit. Marx openly and clearly said that the revolution can only happen in the most highly industrialized societies. Like in his time, say Britain or Germany. By the 1900s, the United States would be included, and probably France also. Why do they have to happen in industrialized societies? Because they already have the factories that are making the stuff that people need. If a revolution hits an industrialized society, you can keep the factories running to make enough clothes and food and water bottles and paper and all the stuff that people use on a daily basis. It won't be much of a big change for the masses of the people. The only thing that will change is that the government will now run the factory. The people are still provided for in an industrialized society. But Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky and all these other guys pushed the revolution in probably the most backward economy of the major European powers. Russia is basically what Britain looked like in the early 1800s. They are 100 years behind. So that is probably the worst place that Karl Marx would have pointed at in the European system for the revolution to start, because there just weren't enough factories to continue providing the things that people need. Moving on. Marx said that industry and agriculture, the factories and the farms, have to be run by worker groups. The committees of workers. Because the factory workers, they've been working there a long time. They know how the factory functions. They know how to make it function most efficiently. Whereas Lenin and Stalin talk about that when they're trying to get into power, but once they get to power, they actually run the factories from up on high. Stalin and Lenin set the economic policies in an office building somewhere in the capital city. They don't actually go into the factories. They don't have factory experience themselves. So they don't rely on the experienced workers the way Marx wanted to. Marx openly talked about the communist revolution. Its purpose is to create equality and laws that all people would have to follow, regardless of your background, who your family is, if you used to be rich or poor. The communist revolution is supposed to also be a democratic revolution. That's what makes it work. If all the people, the adults, get a vote for their political leaders, and you have government running the factory system, then if you don't like the way the government is running the factories or the economy, you just vote them out of office and bring in someone you like more, who promises to change things, who promises to mess with the statistics or the investment or something like that. So Marx clearly called the communist revolution the victory of democracy. He said you cannot have democracy without communism. You cannot have communism without democracy. They have to go together. If they're split apart, you get some kind of shell, some kind of image of democracy without the reality. And Lenin and Stalin completely destroyed democracy in the Soviet Union. They do not accept the Constituent Assembly. They make all other political parties illegal outside of the Communist Party, and they don't allow people to vote for their leaders. The party will run the country, and you go to college, you get your degree, and you can go into the low party membership, and throughout the decades you can get promoted to the point where maybe in your 50s, 60s, 70s you could be one of the government leaders, but you're never voted on. You're only promoted when you do a good job for the party. So the party is a dictatorship, clearly. And that dictatorship destroys all facets of democracy and freedom in the Soviet Union for generations. So Marx said that this revolution, the communist revolution and democracy, would free the people. The people are under capitalism, are repressed economically through wage slavery, and they're repressed politically, usually through some kind of monarchy or authoritarian system. So Marx had this vision that this would be the future of human freedom. And again, Lenin and Stalin pay lip service to it. They say, yes, communism equals freedom, but they don't actually build freedom. They build a totalitarian state. That is the exact opposite of freedom in a whole lot of ways. So Karl Marx was often very different from what eventually goes into place in the Soviet Union.